morning. Thank you. One of the fun things that I do at St. Mary's, one of the many things, is I get to facilitate the Louise T. Archer Artist in Residency program. We started it back in 2001, and we've had a nationally renowned artist come each year. What becomes more and more fun for me as a teacher is to see some of our former students come back and share with us their gifts. This morning, you're going to get to see Maria Zoccola. She is a poet and educator from Memphis, Tennessee. Her debut poetry collection, Helen of Troy, 1993, reimagines the Homeric Helen as a dissatisfied housewife living in small-town Tennessee in the early 90s. The really cool part about that is that her book of poetry comes out next Tuesday at Novel, January the 14th at 6 p.m., and she'll tell you more about that. Maria's work has previously appeared in The Atlantic, the Kenyon Review, the Iowa Review, the Sewanee Review, Poets and Writers Magazine, and elsewhere. Her work has been nominated for Best New Poets, Best Spiritual Literature, and Best Small Fictions. Has been a finalist for Best of the Net, and received a special mention for the Pushcart Prize. Maria graduated from St. Mary's Episcopal School in 2011 and has writing degrees from Emory University and Falmouth University. Please help me welcome Maria Zoccola.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Hi, St. Mary's. I am so thrilled to be here. As Ms. Madden just said, I am a poet, and a couple of years ago, I was sitting on my front porch with my notebook in my lap when the little boy who lives next door, who was maybe about 6 years old at the time, wandered over to my porch and asked me what I was doing. I told him, well, I was writing a poem. And of course, he immediately kind of tilted his head to one side and asked me, what is a poem? Now, I don't know if you've been around a lot of 6-year-olds lately, but they have a powerful talent for dropping absolutely enormous questions in your lap, like, what is love, or what does it mean to die? And then you're left scrambling, trying to come up with an answer that is both correct and comprehensible to a 6-year-old. What is a poem? On the face of it, it sounds like a question that I, a poet, would be perfectly positioned to answer. And yet, answering felt nearly impossible. Poetry, to me, is an ocean of sound and emotion and history and future, and here I was being asked to cram it all into a fishbowl definition. At the time, I thought hard for a few seconds and then told my little neighbor that poetry was a beautiful way to say something that is true, which isn't a bad answer necessarily, although it was, of course, entirely useless to a 6-year-old. What is poetry? That question has been haunting poets since the dawn of poetry as a written form. An entire category of poetry, the ars poetica, is devoted to exploring through the medium of poetry the reason for the very existence of the craft and what the work is that poetry should strive to do in the world. In truth, the question, what is poetry, always comes bound together with a second question, maybe even a larger question, which is, why does poetry matter? In a world increasingly devoted to business, profit, technology, artificial intelligence, why in the world would I still be sitting on my front porch, notebook in my lap, working on a new poem? To answer that question, as always, I turn to poetry itself. I want to share one of my very favorite poems with everyone, even though this poem is very, very sad. It's a sonnet by American poet and educator Sophie Clark, and it's called Tender. I spend late morning weeping with the news. A black bear with burnt paws is euthanized along the latest wildfire's newest edge. It was crawling on its forearms, seeking a place to rest. I Google more, reports leak out. The bear had bedded down behind a house below a pine to lick its paws. In hours before its end, officials named it Tenderfoot, though some reports report just tender. Later, I will teach a class where we'll discuss the lengths of lines in poems. I'll say, a sonnet is a little song to hold a thing that otherwise cannot be held, a lonely thing, a death, a bear. What is a poem? Why does a poem matter? There's no explanation better than the one Sophie Clark gives. A sonnet, a poem, is a little song to hold a thing that otherwise cannot be held. All of those absolutely enormous questions 6-year-olds are so fond of asking: what is life? What is love? What is death? Who are you? Who am I? Poetry holds them all. You think that something inside of you, some emotion, some broken place, is too huge and ugly and complicated to exist outside of your body. And then you come across a poem that understands you so completely, it's like looking at an X-ray of your own soul. That's why I first fell in love with poetry. At St. Mary's, of course, we spend our entire educational careers reading widely in the genre, from Shakespeare to Walt Whitman to Langston Hughes to my most enduring poetic love affair, Homer. But it wasn't until I got to college that I had the breathing room to strike out on my own and explore the contemporary poets shaping the literary landscape of our present moment. I read poets like Jericho Brown, Natasha Trethewey, Dana Levin, Sharon Olds, Tracy K. Smith, and hundreds of smaller poets who were just getting their foot in the door, publishing with small presses or in magazines, whose work thrilled me, whose poems sometimes felt as if a lightning bolt were traveling over my skin. I read poetry constantly, but I studied fiction in both college and grad school, and I still thought of myself at the time as primarily a prose writer. After grad school, I moved to Savannah, Georgia to run a nonprofit program called the Young Author Project, which put creative writing workshops into the public middle and high schools of Chatham County, Georgia. I worked with about 400 young writers every year, many of whom were trying creative writing for the very first time. I think that watching their bravery as they dove into poetry and other genres gave me the confidence to set aside the short stories I was always working on and begin writing poetry in a serious way. It was as if a whole new universe had blown open for me. I began publishing my poetry in journals and magazines, making friends with other writers, and carving out my own corner of the contemporary poetry landscape. In 2021, soon after moving back home to Memphis, I began work on the series of poems that would become my debut collection, Helen of Troy, 1993. In early 2023, I signed with a literary agency and sold the full collection to Scribner, an imprint of Simon & Schuster. The collection will be released this coming Tuesday, January 14th. We're having a big party at Novel Memphis on Tuesday at 6 o'clock, and I hope everyone in this room can come. I'll read a few poems from the collection, I'll talk about the collection a little bit, and there will be a lot of cake. These days, poetry has become a part of my identity, a way of understanding myself and the wildness around me that feels right. In grad school, while I was backpacking through Slovakia, I spent some time inside a small Orthodox church at the edge of Bratislava. The church was hundreds of years old, and it was under major construction. Half of it was walled off with tarps and beams and supports, and workers were shouting and using power tools and tromping back and forth. But the church was still open, and worshipers were coming in and out all the time, praying at the icons and lighting candles. I felt, standing in the midst of all of this holy chaos, that I was right on the edge of something, that there was something here just beyond my comprehension, as if my feet were right on the edge of the border between the world I understood and the sublime. I left that church, I left that country, I left that time in my life when I was mainly living out of a backpack, but I could never leave that memory. It prickled and itched at me for months and years. I needed to do something with it. It needed to become something, but I couldn't figure out what. Finally, I realized that it needed to become a poem. The truth is, I started writing poetry so that I could write this poem, to take that single step across the border between the understandable and the sublime, to find the little song that can hold a thing that otherwise cannot be held. When the Savannah young people helped me become brave enough to try poetry in a serious way, this was the first poem I ever wrote. I published it in a literary magazine, and somewhat shockingly, it went on to receive a special mention for the Pushcart Prize. And because we're here together in another kind of church, and because we know what poetry is and can be in this world, I'd like to leave you with it this morning. Saint Somebodies. Construction in the sanctuary. Clamor of machines, pneumatic this and that, hard hats, laughter under weight of angels peering down. Sneakers on mosaic, murals through floating dust, a hammer, metal on tile, smell of things torn down. Sunlight in rivers through open doors, lunchtime rush still streaming in, long dark skirts, coins fed to the wooden box. Icons, gold and gold, wide-eyed behind smudges from lips and breath. At the Virgin, a grown man, forehead pressed to hers, lips moving silently, reciting, fingers stroking down the glass. On his face, something that hurts to see. Workers pass and cross themselves, back and forth, hands like birds. A drill, high whine, candles in ranks of gentle smoke. Orange vests, rough beams on their shoulders, shouting from the back. Down the steps, traffic, exhaust like incense, a beggar on the curb, her child on her knees. Thank you.